eyeball to eyeball with me, and I never realized I was the only one left. They said I was screaming like a wild man.
The date was May 7th, 1970, and a small American Army platoon had spent the night on an isolated hilltop overlooking the A Shaw Valley in South Vietnam. But just before sunrise, hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers moved against the position. The fighting that followed was violent and chaotic, and it looked like the small fire base was going to be overrun. Amid the fighting, one young soldier from Girard, Ohio, repeatedly moved through enemy fire, carrying ammunition, defending weakened positions, and drawing fire toward himself as the platoon struggled to survive. More than 50 years later, that same soldier would stand inside the White House, where the United States government would finally award him the Medal of Honor. This is the story of Kenneth J. David and the battle for Firebase Maureen. Before Vietnam, before Firebase Maureen, and long before the White House, Kenneth J. David was growing up in the small city of Girard, Ohio, just north of Youngstown in the industrial Mahoning Valley. In the years after the Second World War, towns like Girard were shaped by steel mills, railroads, and factory work. It was a blue-collar community where hard work mattered, patriotism ran deep, and military service was familiar to many families. Born on January 21, 1950, David spent his early years in a world far removed from the jungles of Vietnam. As a young boy, he became active in the Boy Scouts, eventually earning the rank of Eagle Scout, an achievement that reflected discipline, responsibility, and a willingness to help others. At the time, there was no reason to believe his future would become part of American military history. But by the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had already begun reshaping the lives of an entire generation. And for Kenneth David, that moment arrived in August of 1969, when he was drafted into the United States Army. Like many young men of his generation, the transition came quickly. One chapter of life ended almost overnight, replaced by uniforms, early mornings, strict routines, and the constant demands of military training. David began basic training at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where civilian life disappeared fast. The days were structured and demanding. Recruits learned discipline, physical endurance, weapons training, and the realities of military life. Long marches, field exercises, and hours on rifle ranges became part of everyday routine. For many young soldiers, it was also the first time they had spent extended periods away from home. After basic training, David was sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana for advanced infantry training. By then, there was little doubt where most of these soldiers would eventually go. Fort Polk had developed a reputation among soldiers preparing for Vietnam. The heat, humidity, thick vegetation, and demanding field exercises were meant to resemble the conditions waiting overseas. For young men barely out of high school, the experience could be overwhelming. Training was no longer simply about becoming a soldier. It was preparing these young men for combat. By the end of 1969, Kenneth David's training was complete, and in January of 1970, he boarded a plane for South Vietnam. Kenneth soon arrived in South Vietnam, joining thousands of other young American soldiers sent halfway across the world into a war many were still trying to understand. He was assigned to Company D, 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. The 506th carried a long military history. During the Second World War, soldiers of the regiment had parachuted into Normandy and fought across Europe as part of one of the Army's most recognized divisions. But by 1970, the 101st Airborne had shifted away from large parachute operations and instead relied heavily on helicopters to move troops across the countryside. And by the spring of 1970, he and the men of Company D found themselves operating near one of the most dangerous regions in South Vietnam, the A Shaw Valley. In early spring, the 101st Airborne launched Operation Texas Star, a large effort aimed at disrupting enemy activity across the region. As part of that mission, small American units began reoccupying remote hilltop positions overlooking the valley. And one of those places was an abandoned firebase known as Firebase Maureen. a place few Americans had heard of, but one that would soon become impossible for Kenneth to ever forget. After arriving, the platoon searched the area and conducted reconnaissance around the hilltop before settling into defensive positions for the evening. The atmosphere was uneasy. Years later, David would estimate that large numbers of North Vietnamese troops had already been operating nearby, including infantry and sappers armed with explosives. But on the hilltop that evening, the Americans could not yet see what was moving toward them through the darkness. And sometime before dawn, everything would change. Without warning, North Vietnamese forces attacked the hilltop. The small American platoon, outnumbered and isolated, suddenly found itself fighting for survival. The first moments were violent and confusing. Gunfire tore across the firebase as explosions struck defensive positions, and men scrambled to understand where the attack was coming from. For David, the morning began behind the platoon radio. As a radio telephone operator, his responsibility was communication. At some point during the battle, he handed the radio to the platoon sergeant. Then he gathered what he could carry: his rifle, 28 magazines of ammunition, and as many grenades as he could carry, and moved toward the perimeter. By then, the firebase was already in danger. Many men were wounded, and others were pinned down. At times, David intentionally exposed himself to enemy fire in an effort to draw attention away from wounded soldiers and vulnerable positions. Enemy fire followed him. At one point, a satchel charge exploded nearby. Later, a rocket-propelled grenade detonated close enough to wound him with shrapnel and damage his hearing. The blasts tore into his back and ruptured his eardrums. Even then, he remained in the fight. After hours of fighting, enemy forces started withdrawing into the surrounding jungle. The platoon had suffered devastating losses. Every American on Firebase Maureen had become a casualty, and 6 men lost their lives. Robert Berger, Peter Cook, Jose Gonzalez, Lloyd J. Jackson, Robert Lohenry, and Joseph Redmond were killed defending that hill. Only after the wounded had been evacuated and the firebase secured did David finally allow others to treat his own injuries, and was evacuated with the other wounded men. Eventually, he was transferred to Valley Forge General Hospital in Pennsylvania, where he spent the next several months recovering. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor in combat. And like many other veterans of Vietnam, he eventually returned home carrying memories of a war that few people outside it could fully understand. More than 5 decades after the battle, Kenneth David walked into the White House. On January 3, 2025, President Joseph R. Biden Jr. awarded Kenneth J. David the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award for valor in combat. The recognition came after a review upgraded the Distinguished Service Cross he had originally received decades earlier.
Between values at home and at the unit. These values carried me through the toughest battles of my life on May 7th, 1970, in Vietnam.
The Medal of Honor is awarded only for acts of extraordinary courage and self-sacrifice performed above and beyond the call of duty. Today, little remains of Firebase Maureen. The hilltop has long since been reclaimed by the jungle, but the events of May 7th, 1970, still remain. A small American platoon fought for survival on an isolated hilltop against overwhelming odds, and 6 men never came home. The men who sacrificed there should never be forgotten.
Hello. We here at Battle Docs would like to extend our thanks to the people who watch our videos. I think it's important that we remember these men and women who sacrificed so much for our country. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. We'll see you on the next video.